We're going over Chapter 6, Merchandising Transactions. This is Part 1 on the terms of merchandising transactions. Merchandising transactions happen when a seller sells inventory to a purchaser or a buyer. When that happens, there's a contract between the seller and the buyer, and there are several terms associated with the contract. Let's take a look at some of those terms. First of all, the sales contract will specify an FOB point. The FOB point is important to accountants for two reasons. Mainly, it's where the ownership passes from the seller to the buyer. So once the goods have passed the FOB point, the seller has earned the revenue and can record it at that point, and the buyer has incurred the purchase and can record it at that point. Very important to determine the cutoff procedures at the end of the month. Also, the FOB point is where the shipping responsibility ends. The seller must deliver and pay shipping to the FOB point. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say, for example, that you have a seller in San Francisco and a buyer in New York. In case 1, if the FOB point were the shipping point, that would be San Francisco. In that case, the buyer would be required to pay the shipping from San Francisco to New York and would own those goods during the journey. In case 2, if the FOB point were the destination, that in this case would be New York, where the buyer is, the seller would be required to pay shipping from San Francisco to New York, and the buyer would not own the goods until they arrived in New York. Now, sellers can have warehouses all over the country, so the FOB point could be a third place entirely. So in case 3, if the FOB point were Chicago, the seller would be required to get the goods to Chicago and would own them until they get to Chicago. Once they pass through Chicago, then the buyer would own the goods on the leg from Chicago to New York and would be required to pay shipping on that leg. So hopefully that explains the FOB point a little bit. Now let's take a look at sales discounts. Sales discounts are offered by the seller to the buyer for prompt payment. Why would the seller do that? Well, there are two reasons. Number 1, the faster the seller gets their money, the less money they have to borrow to do things like pay rent and make their payroll and buy inventory. Also, the faster you collect money from somebody, the more likely you are to collect it. So they actually increase the percentage collected of their accounts receivable by offering these sales discounts. So it's smart all the way around. If the sales contract has terms of net 30, the seller does not offer a discount for prompt payment, and the invoice amount must be paid in 30 days from the invoice date. If the terms say net EOM, N/EOM, then also there's no discount, but the invoice amount would now be due at the end of the month of the sale. If the seller offers a discount, you'll see something like 210 net 30, which is the most common. With 210 net 30, the seller offers a 2% discount if the buyer pays within 10 days of the invoice date. Otherwise, the full amount is due 30 days after the invoice date. Any combination of discounts and days is possible. So you could see 115 net 40 or 345 net 60. Whatever the seller wants to offer, the buyer is free to accept or reject. Let's take a quick look at the interest earned by the purchaser by taking advantage of the discount. Let's use the most common as an example, 210 net 30. The question that we're asking is, should you borrow money to take advantage of the discount? Well, you'd wind up borrowing money for 20 days because no matter what, you made a contract to pay in 30 days. So the 30 days is the decision to buy the goods, not to take advantage of the discount. The decision to take advantage of the discount is, should I pay in 10 days or should I pay in 30 days? the decision to pay in 10 days is 20 days early. So you would borrow money for 20 days for this decision. Well, the 2% is over the 20 days. You get a 2% discount by paying 20 days early. Let's annualize that rate by multiplying it by 360 over 20. So if I take 2% and multiply that by 360 over 20, I actually get an annualized rate of 36%. What that means is that if I borrow at any rate below 36%, I would pay less than $1,000 at maturity. Excuse me. I can prove that to you right now. Let's assume that you have a $1,000 payable with terms 210 net 30, and you're wondering, should you borrow at 30%? The above calculation says that this would be a good thing. Well, you would not need to borrow $1,000 because what would happen is you'd get the 2% discount. So to pay in the 10 days, you'd take away 2% of your $1,000 and you'd only need to borrow $1,000 multiplied by 100% minus 2%, which would be $980. So you'd borrow $980 today and pay the vendor. Then what you'd do is you'd owe the bank principal plus interest. The person who sold it to you would be already paid for. So if you borrowed $980 at 30% for 20 days using principal times rate times time, 980 times 30%, excuse me, 980 times 30% multiplied by 20 divided by 360, the 20 days that you're borrowing, results in interest of $16.33. So at maturity, you'd pay back the $980 that you'd borrow and the $16.33 interest. So you'd see you'd wind up paying, whoops, can't believe I did that, you'd pay back $996.33. That seems like a small savings, but realize this example is only one purchase, right? You'd have many, many, many purchases during the year, and this amount is very small, only $1,000. So if you did this over and over during the year, taking advantage of the discount would give you quite a large amount of savings. Now let's go on to the third term that we're going to discuss before we go into purchase and sales transactions. These are trade discounts. Trade discounts are used to adjust the selling price. Even in the days of the internet today, it's very, very expensive to print a catalog. Trust me, I know. And you don't want to keep reprinting it every time your prices change. And there may be times because of seasonality, or you're running a special promotion that you want to alter the price. So to use that, you use what is known as a trade discount. A chain discount is just a trade discount applied successively. So let's say you had a sale that had a list price of $1,000 with a trade discount of 25%. Neither the seller nor the buyer would ever record the $1,000 because it was never sold or purchased at that price. So to calculate the sale and the purchase price, you take the list price of $1,000 and you take away the 25% discount by multiplying that by 100% minus the discount percentage of 25%. And both the seller and the buyer would record that transaction for $750. The $1,000 would never come into play. Now suppose there's a chain discount. So suppose somebody's offering for sale for $1,000 list price with a chain discount of 30% and 10%. Unfortunately, both of those discounts are not applied on the original price. They're applied successively. So you take the $1,000 multiplied by the 100% minus 30%, evaluate that, and then apply the 10% discount on the discounted price. So to calculate that, I'd start with the $1,000. I take away the first discount, so I do 100% minus 30%. Then once that evaluated, I would take 100% minus the 10%, the second discount, and that sale and purchase would be recorded by the seller and the buyer as $630. The original price or the discounts would not be recorded on the books of the buyer or the seller. So hopefully now you have a little bit better understanding of trade discounts, sales discounts, and the FOB point.